So, as you know, we've been having a lot of changes in the regulatory regime. And as I was thinking about it, I couldn't really think of a better person to have on than Mr. Kyle Danish, who obviously works at Van Ness and Feldman. Kyle has been with them, for 26 years, holds a master in public policy from Princeton, a JD from Temple. But more than anything, I think I thought this would be a perfect guest because Kyle, one, helps people make sense of all of the different policy changes and more so than any time, at least than I've been around, tremendous number of policy changes. But then how do you help them influence the policy on a go forward basis? What can be changed? Where are there exceptions? What's out there? And then how do you develop a go forward strategy to help navigate those changes? I was just on a call before this, Kyle, where like the number one topic was people trying to get their hands around what folks are doing in the marketplace as it
Yeah.
relates to all the uncertainty. So, like I said, I could not think this is your full time job, if you will, to help people navigate this. And so I couldn't think of anything better, anyone better than having you on. So you tell me where I butchered your background or what it is that you do.
No, that's a great intro and very generous, Will. It's great to have a chance to talk with you. I mean, the vantage point that you and Project Canary have in this market is very important and valuable, and I think this will be a fun conversation as we try to make sense of what's going on and think about how companies should respond to it.
Yeah, it's definitely a rapid change time period. I think one of the things that can catch me off guard is you have to be so in the news flow for a lot of this
Yeah,
stuff. It's rules rolled back, and then I'll just give you an example that's not really related to this, and then we'll get into some of what we're going to discuss. But I saw, the funds were frozen for a lot of climate programs under the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed in the Biden
right.
administration. And then I saw something yesterday or the day before yesterday where a judge said that they had to be unfrozen immediately. But then I saw something from someone in the administration which said there's no way they're going to unfreeze them. So
Yeah.
we're vectoring towards like how do you force their hand, and people are trying to plan staffing and everything else around this. So it's a difficult time
No,
period to find.
it's a great example. You know, the court said we're going to stay your action while we consider it, and then the administration said we want you to stay your stay. So it's just everybody's trying to move and halt and move and halt. It's pretty bewildering to keep track of.
Yeah, I was joking with you one of the last times we spoke, and I said we'll get Law 360, and I'll have to like write out because there's so many double, triple,
Yeah.
quadruple negatives, right? It's like you stay the
Yes.
stay, which it was to stay the appeal, which was overturning the rule, and I just will lose my mind. So one of the things I ask is in this discussion if we can try to like almost cut through the
Yeah.
four
Yeah. Let's
contradictory
do
things.
that.
Yeah, just to be
Let's
like,
do
this is
that.
what they're doing, and kind of flip through it all. So I guess some things at a high level, what I would like to cover, and you tell me if there's anything different, or what are the ins and outs of all the different changes that the Trump administration is
Right.
proposing as it relates to, I would say, the traditional oil and gas utility type business, right?
Yeah.
Methane rules on measurement, reporting, mitigation efforts, what you will. And then the second thing that I'm thinking about is how, you know, are companies thinking about this on a go forward activity basis? Right?
Yeah.
Like, how does this affect what they're doing in the near term? How does it affect what they're doing in the long term? I'll tell you some of what I've heard in the marketplace, right, and everything else looking out. And then how do we think about, kind of this other bucket of external factors that could potentially shock this system? So, like
Yeah.
one of the things is people are now getting very worried about a recession, right? Given
Right.
everything going on, and so a lot of people had a stay the course mindset, at least that I spoke to. But like, how much does that change if the price of commodities falls off the
Right.
table? There's this whole overlay with commodity buyers out of the European Union and potentially Asia. There's this idea of shareholder lawsuits if enforcement is relaxed and kind of on both
Hmm.
sides, which we'll get to. So I don't know how that sounds to you, or if you have anything else you're looking to chat about today.
No, that's great. That's great. Why don't we start by just understanding what the landscape is right now for these policies, the methane policies specifically. You know, it's interesting when the Trump administration was taking office, a couple of us did a paper looking at like basically the question, will the Trump administration mend or end methane policies? And we looked at what the big industry groups had submitted in the way of comments to the Trump transition team about what they wanted. And basically, the theme was mend it, don't end it. They mostly said, look, we don't love these policies, but we think you should keep them and uh, but modify them. We have ideas for changing them. And so it's interesting in light of that sort of set of industry preferences, and we can talk about that. What has actually happened? Well, you look at um, the big methane policies that are out there. Now, the first one I'd talk about is the methane fee, the so-called waste emissions charge that was brought in through the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022. Now, that one, most of the industry said, we don't like that. That we would sort of like to go. So what's happened so far on that? Well, the Trump administration can do a little bit there, but that actually requires Congress to change the law, right? Because it's actually illegal. It's actually in the Clean Air Act right now. And so I think what we're watching is whether Congress, the Republican members of Congress in particular, who are working on this budget reconciliation bill, use that to take away the methane fee. Because the methane fee actually came in through a budget reconciliation bill in the Inflation Reduction Act. And what's great about those, if you want to do something, you don't have to overcome a filibuster, right? All you need is a simple majority. So we're watching to see if the methane fee is taken out in a budget reconciliation bill. Most of industry would like to see that happen, it seems. Um, the other things, though, are not as easily addressed through Congress because they can't be done. They don't have money involved in them, so they can't be done through budget reconciliation. You're subject to a Senate filibuster. Democrats can block these actions. So when you look at the other big methane policies, that's going to be something that the Trump administration has to sort of do on its own to change them using their own legal authorities. And that's the Quad B, Quad C rules from EPA and the Subpart W reporting rules, both of which were updated at the end of the Biden administration, with major changes.
I think that's a good point to make sure, like with all the nomenclature and wonky regulatory speak, to get everyone on the same page of what those things are, what you just said. So, and tell me where I'm wrong. You're the expert on this.
Sure.
Let's take Subpart W. Subpart W is the mechanism by which companies report their emissions. Emissions from what? Largely some stuff that resembles upstream oil and gas infrastructure, right? When
Right.
you move into the midstream and there's combustion, there's something called Subpart C. So we're largely talking about this piece. Now, that said, there are still CO2 emissions that are reported in Subpart W, but that's really what we're talking about. Then when we get into the Quados, and I say this to people who are watching for the first time, that's 4 capital O's and then a lowercase b in the case
Right.
of Quad B. That's a part of the NSPS, or News Source Performance Standards. And what they're really trying to do there, if I got this correct, is to regulate how facilities are constructed and operated after a certain time period. So when we talk about the B, Quad B, that applies to facilities constructed something after December 2022.
Yep.
Yeah. And then if we talk about Quad C, this is the interesting one. And this is where I always thought this was the hot button one. That's everything else, right? All the existing stuff. And that's, I think, what worried, understand, with so many of the folks in the industry. So those are kind of the big pieces. I may have missed one. We talked about the waste emission charge. But the one thing that we'll get to a little bit later is, I call it like the jugular vein, and that is the endangerment finding.
Right.
So rather than going through and saying we're going to change the rules to be more lax on Quad B or C, or make reporting less onerous on Subpart W, or less detailed, they say, we'll just kill them all in one fell swoop. And that's the endangerment finding, which we'll save to the end. So one, I recommend everyone look at the piece that you and some colleagues outside of Ness Feldman did on the mend or end paper. It was awesome. I really did. It was kind of the start of who knows what's going to happen. But let's dig through those really fast. And where is each one of those things, and how long is it going to take to change? So subpart W, quad B, quad C. For the time period, we'll leave the waste. We can talk about the waste emission
Yeah,
charge,
yeah.
but we all kind of
Well, yeah,
agree
no, let's put the
that's
waste
the
emissions charge to the side for a moment. That's a sort of
yeah.
got to watch what Congress does. Got to watch that budget reconciliation bill. Are they gonna get rid of that? Now, Quado B and Quado C, which I think you've described well. B is about sort of the newer facilities. C is about everything else. And to your point, they're really about requiring a whole bunch of interventions at facilities to reduce their methane emissions at very granular levels. So can't rely on Congress to get rid of that. Going to have to change it. So what the Trump EPA has said is that they sort of right now, in my sort of mend it or end it formulation, they're sort of saying yes. They're looking at both streams. So the mend it side, well, the end it side is what you're referring to as the endangerment finding, right? So when EPA is doing a regulation for greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act, which is what the Quado B and Quado C rules are, the whole predicate for them to do that is a finding they made back in 2009 that greenhouse gas emissions endanger public health and welfare. And then there's a sort of related finding to that. And so one of the things that the Trump EPA has said is we're just going to reverse that endangerment finding in some form or another. And by doing that, knock the whole foundation out of our authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from anything, not only oil and gas, but power plants and automobiles, and just take away, we're just sort of cut off our authority to do that. That's sort of the kill button, the kill switch, right? Um, Now, we can get into it if we have time and we want to. That's not a clean kill, right? It's not. Well, let's say it. There's some questions about whether the EPA can really do that and support it against legal challenges. It's a little bit of a. I'll use another metaphor. It's a little bit of a swing for the fences. So it sort of looks like they're hedging their bets because they've also said, "Hey, we're gonna go through a process to modify the Quado B and Quado C rules. So come in with your suggestions now, and we're going to start a process to do that. And we're going to move really quick on that, right? They've indicated that they're going to try to move fast because they want to get that done in time to have any of the legal challenges and whatever occur during this term. So again, they're going on two avenues here. One is try to do the kill switch, but also then try the mend it strategy in case the kill switch doesn't work, that the courts shoot them down on that. And they've said something sort of similar for Subpart W, the reporting program, which has sort of different authorities involved in it. But they interestingly, they've sort of made this announcement, we're going to roll back all of the greenhouse gas reporting programs. We're just going to take all of them out. But by the way, not the one for oil and gas, which I think may reflect a view that the industry sort of has said, like, we sort of want some reporting. Um, it's helpful to have a federal reporting program, and we can talk about why that might be. But I thought that was interesting. They're getting rid of it for all these things, but that's the one they seem to say, we're going to keep that. And again, same thing, bring us your suggestions and we're going to undertake a quick rulemaking to modify it. Um, so and then the other thing they've said, they announced this in March, they just announced that while we're doing this, both trying to reverse the endangerment finding and trying to do these little mend it rulemakings, we're not going to enforce the rules that are on the books. And I have to say, I've never seen EPA say that certain rules that are like on the books right now until they go change them and therefore are the law, they just won't enforce. So, the agency has some enforcement discretion, right? They, like a prosecutor, they don't, they can say, well, this one's a little tough case or something. But I've never heard them say as a blanket statement, we're just not going to enforce these. So that creates some interesting dilemmas for companies about what to do right now. But that is the landscape of what we're hearing from the Trump administration. Um,
So many thoughts. So as we talked about, like one, you help people understand like all the different changes, right? Which is a big part of your job. You then also help influence some of the changes. So one of the things I do want to get to, like, what are you seeing on let's call it demand for Quad B and Quad C, like the details, what in particular? Same with Subpart W. If they're not going to get rid of it, what is it? One of the things I want to do is go back and kind of get everyone on the same page of the endangerment finding and kind of what's being claimed there, because I had an interesting exchange at a large customer, a few of them really the other day. I also want to talk about the bandwidth and then the enforcement piece. So just on the endangerment finding, the read was that, hey, this was already contested in the Supreme Court. I think it was Massachusetts versus the EPA, if I remember correctly, in
right.
2009, and they visited this issue and said, yes, you have the ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. But then if you listen to what Zeldin said in his confirmation hearing, he said, yes, they said we have the ability, but we don't have the requirement. And so that's an interesting tact, at least as I understood it. And you tell me again, you're the expert here, not me. But that's an important piece. And I know it's been, at least what I've read, is largely on people have thought about, can they really challenge the Supreme Court? And the answer is the very likely lose, because the amount of evidence since the original finding has only grown, right?
Yeah.
But there's this issue of requirement versus ability to is one piece. So that's
Right.
kind of just getting everyone on the same page of what's going on there. The other piece I talk about bandwidth, right? Because practically speaking, we're hearing about the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, all the time, laying off staff left and right. How much of that, really is going to be sustained, because some of them have been ordered to be reinstated by judges. This is what I mean. It's back and forth, back and forth. But if you're trying to prepare a compelling case on the endangerment findings, also while you're undertaking new rulemaking on Quad B, Quad C, and Subpart W, and by the way, everything that's outside of what we're largely talking about here, oil and gas
Yeah.
regulatory programs, like how are they going to have that bandwidth? Right, is kind of my question. Is that
Yeah.
practical, or are they just going to jam it through and be quote unquote like sloppy with it in your mind? And we'll stop there. One, did I get the endangerment finding right?
Yeah.
Are you hearing the same
Yeah. Yeah.
thing?
Let me
And
let
two,
me
are they
let
practically going to be able to do this?
No, these are great questions. Let me take this in a sort of in order of operation here. So first about the endangerment finding, people talk about like there's sort of a lot to it, right? So the basic idea is the way that the Supreme Court looked at this in the Massachusetts v. EPA case is, if you find that greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare, then the way we read the Clean Air Act, you are required to regulate sources of those greenhouse gases. Now, that was one way to get at that is like, well, that was actually a 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court. And none of the five that made up the majority are on the Supreme Court anymore. In fact, it's a lot of different people. But there was a very, vigorous dissent from Justice Scalia that said what you're hearing, right? Which is, no, there's still another step here. If you make the finding that they endanger public health and welfare, you can determine when, whether, how to regulate. There's an area of agency discretion there, not a mandatory thing. So some people say, look, if you brought this back up to the Supreme Court, the conservative justices that now dominate the Supreme Court, the sort of Republican nominated Supreme Court justices, would likely overturn Massachusetts v. EPA and go with the Scalia dissent as the better reading of the law. So that's one possibility. Another possibility that would work with the endangerment finding is that when you're talking about, you have to sort of read it a little bit in context for different types of parts of the Clean Air Act. So to regulate the oil and gas sector under the new source performance standards, which is where you find Quad B, you find that these are greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare, and you have to find that this sector significantly contributes to this endangerment. And some people say, well, there's an opportunity for another finding, which says, yeah, these are sort of dangerous globally, but the oil and gas sector is in the United States is a relatively small part of the whole picture, particularly if you're looking at global greenhouse gas emissions, much less global concentrations of greenhouse gases. You're starting to be a very small contribution. So that's another way to get at this. That might, the EPA might say, we think significant contribution is a particular level, and we're just these folks are just below that threshold, and maybe the power sector is enough, but that's it. Now, so these are all potential theories out there that you could use to cut off the endangerment finding and then cut off this authority. Now, there's some interesting questions about whether you can apply them specifically to the oil and gas sector, and this is where it gets sort of complicated. The Trump administration tried some of this in some way or another in the first term. And one of the things that happened was that they got into the crosshairs of a particular type of congressional response under something called the Congressional Review Act. And the Congressional Review Act allows, under certain limited circumstances, a simple majority, no longer the filibuster, 60 some senators, to disapprove of an agency rule. And that happened. And when that happens, two things happen. One, you go back to the prior rule. And so what was happening there was that you can argue the prior rule actually triggered the whole Quad OB, Quad OC thing. So that's one part of it. The second thing, you can't ever come back with something that is substantially similar to the rule that was disapproved. Now, that's never been tested. What is substantially similar? But there are some arguments that because of those actions, this Trump administration can't come back and try this again in some form, because we've now locked in some sort of methane regulation for the oil and gas sector in the United States. So we're now diving our listeners deep
Yeah.
into the sort of, arcane aspects of this. But all of these things contribute to like my general takeaway here is they might be able to do this, but it's not a sure thing. And I think they know that too, which is why they're, again, hedging their bets. Now, this goes to the sort of last part of your question is, wow, they're cutting a lot of people. And I think so far this administration has been in the sort of move fast and break things mode. Um, and, I think they have on board some people who sort of learned from the first time around how to do this. And I think they'll get a lot of input from outside sources. Um, but they've set themselves, a deregulation agenda of the type that they've announced definitely a big agenda. And under sort of ordinary administrative law, you have to, to reverse a regulation, you have to go through the full notice and comment rulemaking process. You have to have a lot of support for what you're doing. So I think it is a fair question about whether they are setting themselves up for success on some of the deregulatory effort. It's going to be interesting to watch.
So much in there. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, I guess, one thing to clarify, Congressional Review Act, I'm going to dramatically oversimplify it, and this may be wrong, but it's generally before you're going to have a change in Congress. It's roughly sometime in August because it's a certain number of congressional days. And I
Yeah.
think, and if the rule isn't published to the Federal Register before then it's subject to be repealed via the Congressional Review Act. This is actually what is ish. I see you moving your head. This is why you're the expert. But this is what killed the waste emission charge, the methane fee, right? Technically speaking. And so that's
It killed the EPA. Yeah, let me
implementation of
the
it,
implementation
but
rule.
it's
So the
still a
weird
law. Yeah.
exactly. That's the
Yeah.
weird thing. That was the two levels down. I didn't go on that. But that's sort of interesting, right? Which is, yeah, they used that the CRA to disapprove the rule that EPA created at the end of the Biden administration to implement the waste fee, the waste emissions charge. But weirdly, the waste emissions charge is still a statutory obligation until Congress does something else with it. So there is this weird situation where somehow unless and until they get rid of the charge, EPA is supposed to calculate it and collect it. And they just took away the apparatus for calculating and collecting it.
So in theory, that would mean in addition to all the other work, the endangerment findings, the quotas, the subpart W, the EPA is then statutorily required to put forward a new way to implement the waste emission charge. Correct or incorrect?
I think we're in unknown territory here. Again, I sort of skipped all that because I think the Republican Congress will probably get its act together to remove the waste emissions charge before you have to go collect it. Um, but we'll see. There's a little
No,
bit of uncertainty there.
I would just, and then I do want to hear some of the suggestions that you're hearing or helping people implement on the quados and subpart W. But I have to add this point, and there is a level of uniqueness about this administration. I have this viewpoint, and it's outside the scope of this podcast, that we're in the middle of a realignment of the parties, right? And kind of what they stand for and what they represent. And the one that jumped out to me last night, and again, this stuff is fast coming, is that the Republicans are openly debating now that they may actually increase the taxes on rich Americans, which is kind of like, it caught me off guard. And then I was reading more into it because it's like, how are they going to be able to sell that? And one of the ways they'd be able to sell that is because the taxes were going to go up anyways at the end of this year. And so
Yeah,
they're saying, well, we didn't actually increase it. We just, didn't stop it from increasing. It's kind of like, okay, this is a weird way to frame it. But that's not something I thought I would have ever read from the Republican administration that previously enacted a sweeping tax cut kind of across the board, but also on wealthy Americans. The second thing is that you mentioned move fast and break things. Who said that? Mark Zuckerberg. Well, last I checked, the FTC is still proceeding with their case against Instagram and WhatsApp to
yes,
basically
right.
force Facebook to sell those acquisitions. And I say this because supposedly Zuckerberg, he gave $1 million+ to the inauguration fund, has been taking trips down to Mar-a-Lago, everything else, and removing content, fact checkers, if you will, all this stuff that kind of seems like
Yeah,
it's paying homage to the current administration. Not saying it's good or bad, but I'm flagging this because who knows what you get, and the Subpart W example is a great example that you gave, right? Like, we're going to remove the reporting requirements for everything except this, right? And
yeah.
again, that's partially at the request of the
I'm
operators
presuming.
out there.
Yeah, I'm presuming that
Yeah.
operators got in saying, no, we'd like to keep this one. Um,
Because we'll talk about that and kind of all the counterintuitive things that can spark off. But let's get into some of the details on what are some of the mend suggestions that you're
yeah,
seeing being put forward on the quados. Quad B, again, for the folks listening, new facilities, Quad C, kind of everything else
yeah,
constructed before December 2022. And what sort of suggestions are you seeing in Subpart W? Because I see the Subpart W thing going in a variety of directions. Some operators that I speak to actually like it because it gives them more control in some
yeah,
ways to override factors. Other people hate it in some ways because they think engine slip or some of the ways
yeah.
that you calculate these super emitters are punitive. But what are you hearing?
I might go in reverse. I think the subpart W. I'm not sure what to expect on that one. I mean, those are highly technical sort of preferences, and I don't know that I could characterize like, well, it seems like most people are asking for X, Y, Z. Um, I mean, I think people would like to see, uh, you know, more allowance for use of advanced technologies, and the the end of the last administration, they sort of opened up a docket to sort of take some new information on that. It'd be interesting to see that this group, that the EPA would continue to take that information and understand more about the advances in those areas. But otherwise, I don't know if I could sort of summarize or characterize the subpart W fixes out there that people have proposed. On the Quad O rules, I think there are a number of, again, also pretty technical types of things. For instance, there's an issue around uh, closed vent systems for which you may be, it looks like you are familiar with this. An example of an area, well, just a step back, the way these regulations work, it's a mixture of some sort of limits, like numerical limits on emissions, but mostly things that you would call work practice standards. Like we can't really measure what's going on here, but we sort of know that if you do this, you apply this procedure or you use this particular type of version of the technology, fewer leaks will occur, lower emissions will result. So much of it is work practice standards rather than actual limits on emissions. So one of the areas where there's like a sort of limit approach is with these closed vent systems, where they're like, well, we don't want to see any emissions from that. And a lot of people in the industry are like, no, that's an area where we should do a work practice standard because, we can't, things go wrong with these systems, these closed vent systems. Sometimes they emit, you don't want to penalize us in that area because you'll just be administering a lot of penalties. So that's one area. There's an area, again, this sort of complex area around modifications. So the big issue around modifications has to do with that
Date.
hinge point between C and B, right? So as you point out, C is like everything else, all your existing stuff. Now, under the way the rules work, there's a little bit more time before we have to like fix up all the older existing stuff. It's the new stuff you have to tackle right away. But if you have an existing thing and you're held to have modified it in some way, um, we're going to treat it like a new facility and make you do the top of the line thing now. On the theory that like you've modified it, well, we should treat it like a new thing. You're basically doing an investment here. The problem is that EPA has created a very low threshold for modifications. Sometimes you're like, oh, I have a whole bunch of controllers at this site. I add one, and now I have to treat this like every controller has to be a brand new thing. And this is driving operators bonkers because it becomes a very heavy investment. There are other things like process controllers are a good example where they're making you do these things where you have to put in brand new, super efficient, low emitting, and some of the operators say like, hey, these are really expensive, and so for every like ton of methane reduced, this is about $1 million. So this is not a very good use of funds. You should find better areas to focus. Just to round out that, there are a lot of things. A starting point for how EPA is looking at this is all the so-called petitions for reconsideration that industry groups filed with the EPA after they finalized the Quad OB and Quad OC rules. These are petitions that say, look, I know you just wrapped this up, but you got these 12 things wildly wrong. You should revisit this. So that's the starting point for what EPA has done. And recently went through an exercise for a client where, 3 cheers for AI, we took about 10 of those petitions and we put them through AI and just summarized there's some common things that come up over and over again. And so if anyone wants to see what's likely to come up, that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, well, I was joking with one of your colleagues in Houston that if you're a legal associate today, AI is like the number one thing that can just
Yes, right.
Yeah, luckily
For our
you're a
next
partner.
podcast, Will, for our next podcast.
I don't want to spook any young folks who are $250,000 in debt from law school. No, you mentioned, and one of the things I've heard, by the way, is how a lot of these rules, and even on like the Subpart W side as well, can be counterintuitive. So like on the modification side, right? You may have a very old facility who you just want to take some, methodical, slow steps to reduce the emissions. Well, wait a second. Now you go out and you do that small modification, right?
Mm-hmm.
Change out the controllers or some of the controllers from, emitting pneumatic devices to air-driven pneumatics, whatever it is. Suddenly now this is a Quad OB site and you find a rap list of all these other things that you have to do. The one I have to ask you about, because this is the one that jumped out to me. And the one that I thought was in the crosshairs the most, I haven't heard you mention it, but there was a requirement on Aquato C for LDAR, leak detection and repair, that resembled Quado B, which is quarterly. If I for complex facilities quarterly, have
Yeah.
you heard people going after that one? And I flag that because I saw some analysis from Enverus some time ago that said that they thought that that would push, that requirement alone would push something like 350 to 500,000 marginal wells. People say stripper wells
Yeah.
into, a sub-economic
Yeah.
realm, if you will. Have
Yeah.
you heard
This
much
is
about that one?
no, no, absolutely. 100%. This has been a constant issue in the evolution of the Quado, right? And there's a Quado A even, there's some of predecessor like, hey, don't come after these marginal wells, right? This will put them, to your point, over the line. And so in this particular rulemaking, EPA went back and forth. They sort of first they had a notion of a threshold. Uh, uh, if you were under a threshold, you'd be spared some of these things. But then they sort of abandoned that in the final rule. And so I expect, and this was definitely, from the owners of those wells and their representatives like IPAA, a strong like, hey, you have to come up with something that spares these marginal wells from this sort of expensive mitigation. So I expect that will be a live issue in the mended rulemaking.
That is a complicated one in many ways, just because, yeah,
Well,
you
and
look at
I remember
who
one of the
operates those
issues
wells
was,
too.
well, it's
Yeah.
hard to set the threshold too, right? Because like they originally had an idea which the threshold, like if your emissions are below X or something like, well, you even have to, that's an exercise in and of itself, right? So you have to go through the, so it'll be interesting to see like how do you pick and other people have studied that issue much more than I have, but there'll be this issue of like how you even construct a test that says what is a marginal well, and how many emissions do you sort of lose if you cut below that threshold. People will certainly be interested in that,
Yeah.
and what sort of competitive, like what sort of, I think some of the bigger players will be like, is that going to create some gaming where operators are going to sort of figure out a way to like split up their operations in order to stay below the threshold? Like, what are my competitors going to do about this? So that'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, there's so many counterintuitive things. I mean, there is the whole Subpart W thing, which we won't get into, but or I'll just mention now. If you emit less than 25,000 metric
Yeah,
tons of CO2e, you're not required to fill out Subpart W. The funny part is you have to do all the calculations before you to say it's like a chicken and egg on steroids
right,
and in
right.
many ways. So it's interesting that you flag this. In the interest of time, I really want to hear more about some of these things that are counterintuitive in
Yeah,
nature, right? So enforcement is one that jumps out to me. I'll tell you, I had two interesting conversations a few weeks ago in Houston. One of them came from a CEO who basically said that we will get bent over a barrel in some of the states that we operate in. This type of company has assets in many states, we'll say, and effectively this person was worried about a fragmentation of the regulatory regime. So before, largely yes, you had state and regulatory, but it didn't differ dramatically, at least not in
yeah,
most states, from the federal side. And now there's a world where you may see this smattering of regulations that just increase the difference in how you calculate things, report things, and you're just going to need to stand up teams and miss deadlines
yeah,
and be subject to fines. Another one said something to the effect of they're worried about what's going to happen under the Newsom administration. I kind of laughed.
yeah, yeah,
But this pendulum swinging back and forth. I hear from anyone who works in large companies, they hate the swinging. Right, they want some sort of
right.
continuity to plan against, and so many of them are saying, "Hey, it's going to be kind of," and you may be hearing something different. Many of the larger companies, business as usual. We're going to continue on the path that we are on measuring emissions
Yeah,
and reducing emissions, if you will. So that's kind of a piece that I'm saying, like, how much are you expecting the states to up their game, if you will, on the regulation or basically relax it? How much disparity will you see from top to bottom? And then what are some of the things I've heard lawsuits proposed, meaning that like if the EPA is knowingly and willingly not enforcing the regulations, if you're a citizen who lives nearby one of these facilities, you can claim harm and basically legal grounds to sue, saying, "Hey,
Yeah,
this is impacting me." Because, by the way, we didn't get into this whole idea of VOCs and hazardous air pollutants. Even if they go after the endangerment finding, the oil and gas companies will still have to report for
that's
things
right.
that endanger public health, which is this whole other can of worms. So they're
Yeah.
not necessarily helping as much as they may think. I don't want to fragment the conversation, but what are you hearing about this idea of lawsuits and kind of legal action that can be taken by shareholders or just normal citizens near these facilities? How are you hearing about these state regulatory regimes and how they may develop and how much disparity may spin out of those?
Yeah, so a couple things. Actually, I'm going to take that VOC point first because it's an interesting one for people to understand. The um, the Quado B rule, the one that applies to facilities constructed or modified after December 2022, also regulates volatile organic compounds, VOC emissions. And so,
Definition for the folks listening: a VOC could be butane, right? It's
yes,
yes, yeah. So
yeah.
it's the stuff that's
Right.
in these oil and gas wells
It's a
either
range
way.
of things, and then you
Yeah.
definitely emit them. Interestingly, there tend to be emitted pre-processing. Processing takes out most of them. So anyway, so from your production and gathering and boosting, and um, so the important thing to know is if they manage to, if the, let's say the Trump EPA, hits the ball over the fence on the endangerment finding, no more regulation of greenhouse gas emissions. Your Quad OB rule still requires you to do all the same things for VOCs. Now, VOCs, they don't, for reasons that are super complicated, that doesn't reach the C level, all of the other stuff. But for all, anytime, so if they get rid of that and you still have the VOC regulation, which you would, over time, everyone would be in the mix, right? As they build a new thing, they'd still have to do all the things that are listed for methane, they do for VOCs, would be required for VOCs. So that I think is an interesting thing to keep in mind. On the issue of states, popping, states stepping up. I think we're definitely going to see that. I mean, I think there's an interesting question. This is another exercise I did for a client. Like, if you think who are the blue states, how much production is in blue states that you might expect to step in? Well, there's some production in California and in Colorado, and if you think New Mexico fits in that category, I mean, I don't see Texas or any of the states in the Permian Basin where there's a lot of, like I don't
What
see
about
them.
Pennsylvania, though? Single largest natural gas producing state in the country. Democratic governor obviously has to be more moderate in nature if you've seen Shapiro talk. But what
Yeah,
about
what about
Pennsylvania?
Pennsylvania? I mean, I think they've talked. They haven't really done one yet,
It's true.
but that'll be the question, right? Like Pennsylvania is a good example. Maybe they're the purple state in this equation. So yes, I think states will step up, and that will cover some of the production map, but not all of it. So I think that's something to watch. On the issue of citizens, really interesting thing here. As I mentioned, EPA has sort of declared we're not going to enforce the rules that are on the books. Well, while we consider changing them, um, under the Clean Air Act, if the EPA is not implementing a mandatory thing, which is enforcing a regulation that's on the books, um, citizens are empowered to come in and play attorney general. So yes, if through some sort of fence line monitoring or satellite monitoring, a citizen group detects a violation and EPA is not going to step in, then it can sort of play attorney general and try to enforce it. So that's a real issue for my clients. Like, there's certain things, parts of these as we talked about, that seem unreasonable or very, very expensive. And so they face this decision like, oh, well, we're going to keep complying, but can we pick and choose a little bit? And yeah, I mean, at the risk that they're caught by a citizen that then can sort of bring a lawsuit. Now, will citizens be able, even will these groups be able to detect your violation? May or maybe not,
Fine.
but there's a risk. And then to your question about how companies are sort of reacting to this, I think, yeah, I think most companies, um, in their near term action is to continue to comply, because most companies have compliance um, uh, programs, and the laws are on the books, and I don't think they're going to take the announcement of EPA that they won't enforce as an opportunity to not comply. Um, and I think companies will want to participate in the rulemaking procedures to change these rules. They have preferences. I think they'll be smart to bring them to the attention of the EPA. I think, there's this sort of longer question of how do they look at this effort by the Trump administration to roll back these rules? And I think you've raised a number of points that I'm hearing from companies. Hey, this has been sort of a pendulum. We saw the first Trump administration attempt to roll back rules that didn't work. How durable is an effort? Can we really count on this effort to roll back these rules? Is one question. Another question is, hey, we have sunk costs here. We've are buying parts and technologies and people, and it may be helpful just to keep going on these things. And we're getting gas savings. There's some efficiencies that come from these things. Um, some companies have corporate commitments around their methane mitigation, for which there would be reputational costs for stepping out of those commitments. Um, some companies face demands from buyers. They may face either direct or indirect exposure to European buyers, that have, there's some regulations in place that might get tougher over time around methane intensity of LNG imports into the European Union. Their shareholders, many companies are sort of eyeing with interest the hyperscalers that want to now may need to buy gas-fired power, and those hyperscalers, many of them have very strong climate commitments, and will expect to see that the gas supply comes with methane mitigation. So, I mean, these are all drivers outside of just compliance with the law that suggest, that companies are feeling, that may cause them to continue the course on their methane mitigation. Now, there are drivers that are coming the other way, for all of those things, and we can talk about those. But those are pretty meaningful drivers for companies to just sort of more or less stay the course on methane mitigation, notwithstanding this sort of rollback effort.
And let's get to some of those countervailing forces that maybe
Yes.
like be pushing against the continuation of that. But before I do, I would argue that citizens, generally speaking, will be able to detect large emission events. You have folks like the Environmental Defense Fund, Carbon Mapper, others who are out there with satellites or planes that are collecting this data. Now, how relevant is that? And we don't know, right? You mentioned citizens are empowered legally under the law as well. So kind of there's at least the framework there. Now, who knows? I guess my fear would be is that it only takes one, crazy judge or whatever it is to start the snowball rolling down the hill. As before, when the DPA is regulating it, like you stem that. But again, this is the eye of the beholder. Who knows? One of the things that I thought was very interesting, what one executive said to me is, yes, they're worried about citizens potentially leveling, accusations and lawsuits. Fine. They were also worried about lawsuits from the quote unquote right anti-ESG folks. And the idea is if the endangerment finding goes the way that the Trump administration wants it to go, the argument is you don't have to do a lot of the stuff that you're doing as it relates to methane emission, greenhouse gas emissions, generally speaking. So me as a shareholder, I will argue that you are not, acting in my fiduciary interest as an officer or board member, spending money on this feel-good stuff, if you will. And I was like, well, that's an interesting take. Where now all of a sudden, damned if you do, damned if you don't. Meaning that,
Yes,
you kind of go more lax. Here come the citizens. If you don't, here come the anti-ESG stuff. The other thing that I thought was pretty interesting is that there is the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0. For everyone
Right.
who's listening, this was heavily championed by the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, and many large and leading companies have signed up. I'm flagging this because I saw a news article, and I don't know if you have, I can send it to you, where Lawrence Korb, a senior advisor of the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Energy Resources, said that the EU methane regulations are a concern for Washington. Now,
Hmm.
this is this whole like question. They haven't formally enacted these regulations in the European Union. So that's one. They've just said that we will regulate methane emissions
Well,
from
they have the first part of it has been enacted, the sort of
yeah, but how
reporting
they're
concept, but not the sort of standards, the sort of
correct. Yeah.
regulatory limits on methane.
Yeah. I would say it's
But
kind of
yeah,
like my analogy is passing the waste emission charge, but then you have the whole how you're going to implement it, if you
right,
will.
sure.
I haven't seen at least any details on how they're going to implement it. So my point is one, like one countervailing force can be anti ESG folks who could come after you, right?
Right,
The other
right.
countervailing force could be, I hear lots of people talking about an impending recession. I had one executive say, wait till the economic data comes out. I bet you will see that Q1 was in a recession. But I have
Yeah,
generally a similar view as well. I think there could be some uncertain times ahead. Normally that leads to belt tightening. Hydrocarbon, or at least oil prices, are down quite a bit. I think a few year lows, if you will. So lots of
yeah.
stuff going on there, countervailing forces. And then you mentioned this other piece where does the United States actually start putting the finger on the scale with the European Union to push back on this OGMP 2.0 EU
Right.
methane regulations? I don't know how much of this you've heard. Some of this maybe off the wall, like anti ESG stuff, but other of it may be salient. You speak and represent many of these
Yeah,
clients. What do you
I
hear?
mean, I think it's going to be interesting to see. I do think it's possible. The European Union is their regulation creates this sort of multi-year process that starts with reporting and may end with you could imagine the US leaning on trade partners in the European Union saying, no, you should abandon this and just buy our LNG. And that certainly would be consistent with the sort of muscular trade policy that they've had. Now, on the sort of anti-ESG shareholder. I mean, I think, I certainly am standing by for that. I think that's going to happen. I mean, you've already seen, you know, many banks drop out of the what was it, the sort of network for financial,
GFAS.
yeah,
Yeah.
all that. So,
Yeah.
are there going to be oil and gas companies that drop out of the out of OGMP
Probably.
2.0? I think it'll be interesting to see. Now, I mean, I think there is a little bit of a difference uh, in that. I mean, one thing is, again, like the laws are on the books right now, so the companies can say, at least for US business, like we're just complying with the regulations unless and until they're changed. That's one thing. Secondly, they can say, well, some of these things save us gas, right? They're actually economic. Um, and then for the things beyond that, I think there's sort of a question like, are they truly? I mean, I don't want to minimize the amount of investment that these companies are making in methane mitigation, but I'm not sure the amount of investment that, Shell makes in methane mitigation maybe rises to the level of a fiduciary question. I think that would be interesting to see, right? Like, how much are we really talking about here? It might be, while meaningful, it might still be sort of a rounding error on a shareholder return. But that will be the thing. I think this is what will play out, right? I sort of think it's very possible that that this is all going to be tested, and we'll see what these companies do. And maybe some of these companies be like, yeah, finally shed this unreasonable commitment and get back to. I mean, uh, I don't know. It's going to be interesting to watch. I think
Yeah.
what we're talking about is, I don't know, 3 months, 6 months away. This sort of debate.
Oh, I gotta hear more why that you have that time frame on it. I guess two things. One, that's a really good point on the meaningfulness, the contribution effect, if you will, of this methane mitigation path. I mean, if that's the case, to take where you're putting down, they could sue over the holiday party or corporate travel policies,
Yeah.
in that case, right? Like, where's the limit here? And this is where you may get too much intrusion. I was talking to someone in the EU as it relates to this whole thing about buying more US LNG, and they're saying, listen, it's not necessarily the methane rules that will turn us off from more US LNG. It's not the current administration, which many of the people in the European Union are not a big fan of. They said we learned our lesson on
Hmm.
being overly reliant on Russia for our natural gas. And this is that they said to me that we don't see a stable partner in the United States.
Yeah.
We're hearing about tariffs and everything else. We just want to diversify our supply. A meaningful supplier, by the way, United States, the largest supplier into the European Union. So that was kind of their pushback on me. I got to get back to your point though. 3 6 months. Why do you think 3 6 months will be the shakeout point?
I don't. I mean, I just think like the um, uh, the anti ESG sort of anti climate wokeism movement, I think, is going to move into the boardroom pretty fast. Um, that's a sentiment that's strong out there, and I think there will be people who want to bring that forward. Uh, when you have the EPA administrator referring to uh, putting a dagger in the heart of the climate religion, I think like that's there's a tone that's being created there that like-minded people will bring into other settings.
Yeah, you're so, because when you talk to folks who work in the EPA, they're very academic, very procedural, and then you hear
Hmm.
comments like that, hate it, love it. I'm not casting a judgment on it. It's more that, like, it's quite a departure from kind
Yeah,
of
yeah, we're
existing,
certainly in
uh,
a different moment, at least
yeah,
from that.
from
Yeah.
the traditional EPA. And so I guess, I mean, again, you have so many different clients who all have these different preferences, different assets, different investors. If you could summarize though, because I view it from more of a narrow lens, you get much broader. That's why I think your insights are so valuable, and would encourage people to kind of chat with you offline because it's even more valuable. How would you characterize kind of what you're, and again, just generally, what you're trying to advise some of your clients to do?
Yeah. I think there's sort of two streams of advice. One is like, hey, we might, in whatever 3.5 years, we might still have the Quad OB and Quad OC rules, and we might still have Subpart W. And so, what do you want those to look like? Hedge your bets here. Like, this presumably this administration will be all ears on things that you would like to have changed. So it's a good idea to think about what you want and think about working with others and going in there and talking with people about that. And then I guess the other sort of stream is if there's really uh, a kill shot on these rules. What? How do you and your market players value some sort of federal standards for even reporting your methane mitigation? Right? If the is it a problem if the federal government just like completely leaves the field and you're back sort of either at the mercy of states, but also like that you're back. I think my sense is that companies have like profoundly mixed feelings about the federal role here. On the one hand, like no one wants to be regulated, nobody wants to pay a fee, um, and if we can keep the government out of our business and do things voluntarily, that's great. But the voluntary side is also sort of a mess, right? Like it's like what am I doing? Is it OGMP 2.0? Is it, this program or that standard and like to have a mishmash of standards, just to, if you sort of think you're going to have to mitigate your methane emissions over time, is it helpful to have some agreed metric for doing that? Like, do we want the Department of Energy, for instance, in a program we haven't talked about yet? Like the Department of Energy was working on this effort to with a bunch of other countries,
Oh,
right, to develop these standardized standards for monitoring, measurement, reporting, and verification, MMRV, just for how you like count what you're doing. And I'm not sure everyone liked where they were going with that, but that's totally voluntary. And I think people thought, at least some people thought, it would be helpful even just to have some common standards for how you record what you're doing. Um, because it does seem like there's going to continue to be a demand for companies that can show that they're doing extra to mitigate their methane emissions, and not having an agreed metric for doing that, it may be just sort of hard, much less being exposed to all the other things we were talking about, blue states coming in with climate programs and, satellite, bound environmental groups throwing lawsuits at you. So I guess that's the other question. So I think it's like two things. One is, take the invitation to go in and fix up these rules because they might survive the day. And then, do you place value on common federal standards, at least for reporting emissions and emissions mitigation? And if so, like, how do you make sure that that survives in some way?
Such good points. I would just say before we wrap it up, the engagement point is such a good. I call it engagement. What do you want the rules to look like? I've made this argument for so long, and mine was more related to the divestment movement that took place, fossil fuels, but many other things, defense contractors or whatever else. I always thought it was a missed opportunity to be able to engage. What do you want to see that's different? Because once you sell, like you have no seat at the table anymore, and you're just
Right.
rattling the cage for the outside. So, like, I guess I don't want to put words in your mouth, but to paraphrase, like if you just walk away and say the endangerment finding's coming, it's going to be my saving grace. You're missing out on a way to weigh into these rules in the case that that doesn't come about, right? So
Yeah.
you actually make
Yeah.
them more effective. And if you watch when I was talking to Steph Shoup in Colorado, she said one of the biggest things that helped Colorado was active engagement by the oil and gas companies because they know
Right.
far more about kind of all the stuff that's going on at their site. So closed vent systems, that's a great example of like they're saying, no, you're missing the larger picture. We have to have some emissions from that, right? So
Yeah.
don't penalize us. Don't make this modifications as you talked about earlier. So that engagement, I think, is a great point in how and what to engage. You have so much better insights to me on what can move and what's kind of like a harder mountain to move. The other piece on the rulemaking, I hear this endlessly, by the way, that investors want comparability. And
Yes.
insofar as there's four
Yeah.
different, frameworks to report your emissions under, and everyone's reporting their emissions differently, I think that's hard. As you mentioned, some of the voluntary emissions reductions will continue forward.
Yeah.
Well, I see some risk there, by the way, if one company's reporting it one way that's overly favorable, if you will, and another company's reporting completely differently, they're going to say, wait a second, now you're not telling the truth to shareholders. Well, now
Right.
you're trying to prove which one of these two, subjective schemes that favor, spatial or temporal, all this wonky stuff, which one's correct. The other thing I've seen is more movement to like endorsement of voluntary, even at the
Hmm.
government level. There's this program called EPA Star that was put about, and
Gas
people are saying,
star. Yeah.
yeah, and so
Yeah.
people are saying like maybe that the government should stand up one of those. But then you start tilting into your world that I've talked about for a long time, where you have like a two-speed commodity market, those that are a part of the
Right.
EPA Star, if you will, and the other ones that are just like generic commodities. And some folks hate that, some folks love that. That's this whole idea of differentiated gas. So,
It's sort of a
yeah,
chaos result.
yeah,
One of my co-authors for that paper I was talking about earlier, the Mend It or End It paper, Kevin Book, has made the point that, just going back to the pendulum risk issue, like if you think there's ultimately going to be methane policy of some sort, um, if you sort of wipe it off the map with the Trump administration, the risk of it coming back really hard and really aggressive is high, right? Because what if you think there's a future president that sort of wants to do this, if they're looking at a completely open field, they're going to be like, oh my God, I'm going to have to come back hard. Whereas if you work with the Trump administration to like modify it a little bit, that's probably a bit more durable as a framework going forward than a completely blank page facing a group that thinks, oh my God, we've lost 4 years.
that's a really good point. Because if you think about the rules enacted under the prior administration, it was Quad OB,
Yeah.
after Quad OA. So they're just going
Yeah.
further,
It's just,
right?
it's just right, right.
And you
It's
could
a, it's
push
a
back on
progression.
it, but it's instead of having to do LDAR 2 times a year at the site, you have to do it 4 times, right? Like,
Right.
okay, fine. But you can imagine if that's gone, now it's like we need direct measurement around the clock 24/7.
Yes,
Like,
right. I mean, you can,
whoa, like
right. You can sort
that's
of
like a
see,
paradigm
imagine the
shift, right?
most, right.
Yeah.
So I think that's the engagement argument. And then the argument of sort of like having some recognizable uniform standards for things so that the market knows what it's dealing with, to your point, right? Just like investors and buyers are sort of saying like, oh, you're telling me this is, you're doing all this mitigation and, you're doing best practices, but how do I know? It's just what you've said. Um, so
Well,
that I think there are reasons to move on from that. I mean, voluntary programs are good. They allow for a lot of experimentation, and they're maybe this is a young enough field that there's still some room to do that. But it comes with that cost of uncertainty and lack of confidence.
and it takes into account preferences. And by the way, we didn't even get into this whole idea of verifiability, right? Which is a different
Right.
dimension. So you can report something, but like, how do you substantiate it, right? And that we're
That's
kind
right.
of
That's right.
nibbling around the edges of that. Well, I mean, if it wasn't apparent at the beginning when I said it, I think it should be apparent to everyone of how many different directions and how many different threads there are here. I would be, inclined to bet that many of the listeners of this will, in some ways, be left more confused after it. And in many ways, I think that confusion is just reality. And
Yeah.
it's important to understand, I think, like the directions that it could go and how far it could go. And in that world, what your risks are. I think of it more of a scenario planning analysis than a very black and white scenario. And I think that's why your insight and kind of advice that you provide to your clients is so salient. Because if there was an easy copy and paste way to do this, there wouldn't be a
We
need to
would all
have.
be doing it. No, I
Yeah,
think that's a
yeah,
very good
exactly.
characterization, Will. It's a really we're in a strategic scenario planning environment right now, and there are a lot of complexities. There are a lot of different ways this could go. No,
So
absolutely, great conversation. This
mm,
is good to work through this.
appreciate it. And Kyle from Van Ness Feldman, like I said, reach out to him if you want far more insights. I always find you even more insightful in private conversations, obviously, because there's only so much you can say publicly. Reach out to Kyle. We'll put his email and the subject line. Thank you for your time, Kyle. And as always, it's great. Until I see you next time.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for a really rich conversation. Great to talk with you as always.
Take care.
All right.